Hi, this is Matt, and today I'd like to tell you about the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which happened on April 19th, 1775. Our story begins in Massachusetts, and we'll zoom in to the city of Boston, where in 1775 British soldiers are garrisoned in and around the city. There's over thousands of soldiers are here. Let's look at a map of Boston in 1775. The British have a good control of Boston. There are thousands of these experienced soldiers, professional soldiers, the British Redcoats. But in the western towns, the colonial militia are starting to gain some control. There's thousands of militia. Every town has its own colonial militia. These aren't professional soldiers, but they're very committed, and there's increasing tensions between the Redcoats and these militia. In April, the British become aware that the militia have a cache of weapons stored at Concord, including ammunition, cannon, all sorts of supplies for the militia. So the British develop a plan under General Gage. They're going to march from Boston to Concord, and they're going to destroy the weapons that are stored in Concord, and then they're going to return to Boston. So that's the plan. And the idea is this will damage the militia and really show everyone that Britain is dominant power, that there can be no challenge to the British power. So this plan is going to be a secret plan. Even the British soldiers themselves who are going to march don't know anything about this plan until the night itself of the march, where the night will begin on 10 p.m. on April 18th. So this plan, it's going to be under cover of darkness, overwhelming force of British soldiers, so the colonists can't possibly respond. And this plan forms the basis for the events of April 19th. I want to show you one more thing on the map. As we go back to Boston, you can see Boston is at that time a peninsula. One way to go west is over the Charles River, and another way to go west is on this long peninsula and then downward and then up. That route is longer. So there's two routes, and one is by land and one is by sea, and that'll become the basis of our next story. Here we are on the night of April 18th, 1775. At 10 p.m., the British will begin their march across Boston, where they'll cross the Charles River. Now, if you remember, this was a secret plan tightly held by the British. But it turns out that the colonists have a spy. Many historians think the spy may be Margaret Gage, the wife of British General Gage, and she's herself born in New Jersey. So the colonists know the plan that was supposed to be a secret. And when when Dr. Warren, a colonist, sees the British start to march, he goes to Paul Revere's house and he tells him that the British are heading for the Charles River. Paul Revere then sets his plan into motion. He tells a friend to light two lanterns at the Old North Church, and this is a predetermined plan. And by lighting two lanterns, colonists all over, including west across the river at the Charles, will know that the British are heading across the Charles. Paul Revere himself will go across town and he'll take a boat across the Charles River. He'll land at what's now called the Paul Revere landing site, and he'll get on a horse and he'll race towards Lexington. He'll arrive there hours ahead of the British. So now that we've seen how Paul Revere fits into this, let's return to the British march. The British will march towards the Charles River, and they'll have barges supported by the British Navy. They'll cross the river, and around midnight, they'll reach the other side of the river. The barges don't quite go all the way across, so they'll have to wade the last part on their own. So when they get across, they're soggy, wet, and miserable. So now the British are heading west to Lexington. That'll be their next stop. And ahead on this road, Paul Revere is riding up ahead. He's much faster than the British on horseback. So the route to Lexington will be about 15 miles, which is a pretty long march for the British. They have all their gear and they're walking, and as I mentioned before, they're wet. Let me just tell you a little bit about the route. We started in Cambridge once we crossed the Charles River. Then we're going to pass through Arlington. Now it's Arlington. Back then it was called Menotomy. And then we're going to go to Lexington. At the time, Cambridge would have been a pretty urban town with lawyers and businessmen and shopkeepers. Our Menotomy was a smaller town with a small town center, but mostly farmland otherwise. And Lexington will be mostly farmland. So as you go west, it becomes more rural. This will become an important part of the battle later, and we'll discuss that. As the British march this morning, however, it is still dark, and there is no fighting along this road. Let's talk about Paul Revere. He's riding on the road ahead, and as he rides, he's going to stop at his friend's house, fellow colonist, and he's going to say, wake up, the redcoats are coming." Now, many of these colonists have horses themselves, and they'll ride out to other towns to alert them. So this becomes a whole network. Paul Revere is alerting people, and they're going to ride out or other people and alert the militia. At this time, every town in um, colonial times has a militia of their own. So Woburn has a militia, Acton has a militia, Billerica has a militia, and all of these militias will be alerted. The militia are also called the Minutemen, and what that means is that they're ready to deploy at a minute's notice. So when the Woburn militia is alerted, they come in the night to defend Lexington and Concord and Menotomy. So as the night goes on, these militia will be alerted and they'll start to arrive at along this path from Boston to Lexington to Concord. The British don't necessarily know that this is happening, that all the militia are being alerted, but as as it gets lighter, they can see that the colonists are coming out, and their march is not a secret. It's hard to march 700 men down Mass Ave and have it be a secret. So around 3 a.m., the commander of the British forces, Lieutenant Colonel Smith, sends a rider back to Boston, and he says, "Look, I'm a little worried, so why don't you have some reinforcements for us?" That turns out to be a pretty good move, and that'll be important later. Around 5:30 a.m., the British redcoats reach Lexington Green. Lexington Green wasn't really on their itinerary. Their mission is to march to Concord, and it doesn't really have anything to do with Lexington Green. But if you remember, the colonists are aware that the British are coming, and they've been waiting all night for the British to arrive. They've been waiting in Buckman Tavern. And when the British enter the town of Lexington, the militia come out to Lexington Green and they assemble there. There's about 100 militia. They're they're not trained soldiers. They're farmers and shopkeepers. Although their captain, Captain John Parker, is a trained soldier. He's fought in the French and Indian War on the side of the British. But other than that, these men are not formally trained. And as I noted, there's 100 militia, which is much less than the British force. The British have 700 professional soldiers, and they're all marching properly. So the colonial militia doesn't really intend to challenge the British force. They line up in formation in a way that the British can just march by them. And they're not really intending to engage. The colonial militia just means to make a statement. We're here, we're the militia, but they don't intend to fight. When the British see the militia, the British line up in formation against the militia. So although colonials didn't intend to fight, and the British, it's not really in their plan to fight. Somehow, both sides line up in a warlike formation. Someone fires a shot, we don't know who, and then battle begins. The British start firing, and the colonials fire back. At the end of this battle of Lexington Green, 8 colonial militia are dead. The rest of them have run under the order of John Parker, who sees that it's an unwinnable battle. No British are wounded or killed. So it's a victory for the British, which is not surprising given their overwhelming force. Perhaps it's also a victory for the colonial militia. They've shown their bravery. They're outnumbered, outgunned, but they're not afraid to line up and die on this Lexington Green. Bravery will be a theme throughout today and throughout the Revolutionary War, that the British may have professional armies and superior weaponry, but the militia are not afraid to get out there. That's a very important part of this battle. And so the British soldiers have won this battle, but in a sense, it will have ramifications that are not favorable to the British for the rest of the day and for the rest of the war. After the Battle of Lexington Green, the British continue on. They'll march through Lexington, through a little bit of Lincoln, and then to their destination in Concord. It's a largely uneventful march. There aren't battles along the way. I now want to briefly return to Paul Revere, his story. Last we saw him, he was riding along the streets of Mass Ave, warning his colleagues that the British redcoats were coming. He reaches Lexington, where he warns Adams and Hancock to get out of town because he's worried that the British will attempt to capture them. So Adams and Hancock get out and they're safe. Paul Revere continues on towards Concord with 2 of his fellow riders, Prescott and Dawes. At 1:30 a.m., Paul Revere is captured on the way to Concord, where it's now called the Paul Revere capture site. The British let him go. It should be noted that these riders are very brave. The British could have easily killed them. It's a risky business, but they do let him go, and Paul Revere walks back to Lexington Green, where he's a witness to the Battle of Lexington Green. Prescott, his fellow rider, will ride on to Concord and warn the Concord militia, and Dawes will ride back to Lexington. So as we march here, as the British march here, it'll be about 8 a.m. when the British pass the Paul Revere capture site. So this happened earlier in the morning. Getting back to the British march, the British are proceeding to what's now Minuteman National Historical Park and marching along Battle Road Trail. There's some historical houses in this park that are preserved. Some of them were present in 1775, some of them were not present. They're called witness houses. They weren't really critical to the battle. We'll also be passing a number of battle sites like Bloody Angle. These sites weren't battles on the way west, but we'll talk about them later when we march east after getting back from Concord. Now, the colonial militia will be marching ahead of the British, a couple miles ahead, and they don't quite have a plan. They don't necessarily want to engage the British. The British have a superior force. And in addition, the colonists sort of have mixed feelings about a full on war with the British. The colonists don't have a deep hatred of the British. It's not that kind of relationship. The colonists are themselves British citizens. So at the beginning of the day, there's tension between the militia and the soldiers, but there's not necessarily hatred. However, as today wears on, as the battles get increasingly bloody, this tension turns into a real hatred. And at the end of the day, we'll see bloody warfare, hand to hand combat. So this day starts in a fairly tense way and ends in a bloody way. Another point as we follow the British march here is I'd like to talk more about the terrain. Earlier in back in Cambridge, I noted that the terrain was unfavorable to the British. There's all these houses and buildings where colonial snipers could take cover. As we marched through Lexington and Concord, the terrain is also unfavorable to the British, just in a different way. There's narrow paths which the British have to wind through, and there's stone walls along these paths. So this provides excellent cover for the colonists. The colonists are very familiar with this terrain, so they know all the twists and turns. There's narrow bridges, which again, it's sort of a choke point. So the British have to march over this bridge, and the colonists can train their fire. So there's hills that are ideal vantage point for the colonists. So all of this terrain is a significant advantage for the colonists and a significant problem for the British soldiers. The British soldiers do have some techniques. They have part of their army are called flankers, and these men will maybe on horseback or maybe on foot, and they'll go to the sides. So they'll try to clear the stone walls and the area around the bridges before the main British army marches through. This is a dangerous job to be a flanker because they're highly vulnerable, and the colonists will be shooting at the flankers when they come. So to some extent, flankers work, but to some extent, the flankers will be attacked and they won't save the British from being shot at. Now we come to the Old North Bridge in Concord, which was the British Army was heading. So now the British have made it to the North Bridge. It's around 10:30 to 12 in the morning, and they're going to cross the bridge, crossing the Concord River. They're going to leave about 150 British troops on the east side of the bridge. That'll secure the bridge because they need to cross it on the way back. And they're going to march about a mile into Concord, where they'll go to Barrett's farm. This is where British intelligence has identified a cache of weapons. The colonists had plenty of notice. They had a couple of days that the British were coming. And on top of that, they were alerted this morning that the British are coming. And on top of that, when the British finally get to Barrett's farm, they take about an hour for lunch, and they buy this lunch from the colonists very nicely. And so the colonists have plenty of time to hide the weapons, to move it to other places, to toss ammunition in the river, and they do this. And so the British find very little. The British burn the ammunition, and they end up some local houses catch on fire. That becomes a problem, which we'll talk about next as we return to the North Bridge. Back at the bridge, you remember there are about 150 British soldiers on the east side of the bridge and about a couple hundred militia on the hill overlooking the west side of the bridge. Nowadays, that's where the North Bridge Visitor Center is. So the militia aren't in a rush to engage the soldiers, although they do have superior numbers. But they're feeling hostile towards the British, but they're not necessarily in a warlike mode. But around sometime after noon, they see in Concord fires. These fires have been started by the British soldiers there. They're burning the ammunition, and perhaps accidentally they've set fire to a few houses in Concord. And the militia say, my God, the British are burning down our town, and now they're upset. So they march down to the bridge. It's not clear what their plan is, whether they're really planning to engage the British soldiers or not. But just like in Lexington, a shot is fired, and then war comes. The two sides start firing at each other. And the militia carry themselves pretty well. Several British soldiers are killed. A few colonists are killed as well. But in general, it's a victory for the colonists. And the British retreat. They retreat back into Concord. So this is perhaps the first time that the militia has acted as an aggressive military force winning a battle, and it feels pretty good for the colonists. They go back on the hill. They don't follow the British. They go back up on the hill, and when the British soldiers return from Concord, the ones that were at Barrett's Farm, when they're marching back, the colonists don't engage them. It's a bit of a question why they don't. Perhaps they don't want to have a battle and incur civilian casualties in their hometown. So the British soldiers march across the bridge, and now the British sort of all join forces. They're in Concord on the east side of the bridge, and they'll begin their trip back to Boston. And they're in retreat, they're hungry, they're tired, and they've just lost a battle. So they're not in good shape. The British have regrouped a little just east of North Bridge, and now they're going to march back to Lexington. This situation is a complete advantage for the colonists in every way. So the colonists significantly outnumber the British. Now, there's thousands of militia that have arrived, and the British have around 700 troops. The British have to retrace their steps, essentially. They really have no choice. So there's no element of surprise. The British have a determined path. The colonists can take advantage of this and understand where the best points tactically to attack the British are. And the terrain, as I mentioned earlier, is highly favorable for the colonists. The colonists can hide behind the stone walls, they can attack at angles in the road, and they do this. And the British are tired and hungry, and it's altogether nothing good for the British here. And so as they march, there's several battles along this Battle Trail Road. One of them was Merriam's Hill. That was a narrow bridge. We're coming up on Bloody Angle. That's a turn in the road that's geographically favorable for the colonists. Another battle will be called Parker's Revenge. Earlier, we had a battle at Lexington Green under Captain Parker, and the troops of Captain Parker are defeated. Captain Parker and his troops get bandaged up and they go right back out again, and they attack the British at this site now called Parker's Revenge, and they do quite well. So Parker was quite, and his troops were quite amazing in the sense that they fight again on the same day. So now the British are returning to Lexington Green, and it's a rout. It looks like the entire British force will be killed or captured by the militia. Fortunately for the British, if you remember at 3 a.m. riding out to Lexington, um, the the British requested reinforcements from Boston. These reinforcements under General Percy of the British will now arrive at Lexington Green. So they save the day for the British. They rescue these British troops that are in deep trouble. So from Lexington Green, the British are going to retreat first to the town of Menotomy, not to be confused with Monotony, which is a different word. Uh, Menotomy is now the town of Arlington, and then they're going to retreat to Boston. So they're trying to get back from where they came. And the British are now led by General Hugh Percy. He's an aristocrat. He's the guy that brought the reinforcements. He seems pretty competent, and we'll see that today. So the British are going to march back along Mass Ave. They make a stop at Monroe Tavern, where they wait for about an hour to bandage their troops and to regroup a little. And then they continue along Mass Ave to the town of Menotomy. All the while, the militia are firing at them along the side of the roads. This Menotomy is a small town at this time. Um, when the British reach the center of town, things get worse for the British because now there's buildings and houses that the militia are using to hide in and around. And they're shooting at the British. The British don't like this at all. They start going to the houses and indiscriminately killing civilians. So that's kind of a war crime. So this becomes a bloody, nasty battle. The scale of the battle isn't that large, but still war is hell. And this is a little, perhaps a precursor to what the Revolutionary War will become. Um, in the town of Menotomy, you can visit today, see some of the landmarks. One of the landmarks is the Jason Russell House. Jason Russell is a man that shoots at the British from his house, and the British shoot back, killing him. And then they go into his house and kill everyone there. So again, a pretty bloody battle. Okay, now I want to take you back to a map for a second. In Menotomy, the British realized that marching through this urban area is very unfavorable terrain, and they're in real danger of getting completely wiped out. So they keep marching, and they get to Watson's Corner. Now the expectation is they'll hang a right, go through Cambridge, cross over the Cambridge Bridge, and then back to Boston. The problem with that plan is that Cambridge is a very urban area. So all these buildings and um, houses that the colonists are using to be snipers, well, that's going to be even worse in Cambridge. So General Percy makes a split-second decision, and he decides to go left at this fork. So instead of going into Cambridge, he goes left up into Charleston Neck. And that turns out to be a really good decision for the British. So what happens here is that the British march up. Now they're not going to be able to cross the Charles, but they have their ships in the river, and so the ships can use their cannon to provide military support. So Charlestown is a safe area for the British. So instead of getting wiped out in Cambridge, they make a smart decision and go to Charleston. Even with this smart decision, it seems like historians think the militia still could have wiped out the British army at certain places along this route, and it's not clear why they didn't. Some people say they deliberately didn't do it. Some historians say there was a miscommunication and they weren't ordered to fire. But for whatever reason, the British will make it back to Charleston Neck. And that'll sort of end this day. Okay, I'll show you quickly how that last leg of our journey looks on the satellite map. We're coming in on the left from Menotomy, and we proceed along Mass Ave. And then there's that junction where you can go right and down south towards the river and go over the Charles Bridge there. But that would be on Mass Ave still. But that's not what the British do. They take a left onto what's now Somerville Ave and proceed along Somerville, and that takes them into Charlestown, where, as I mentioned, it's not easy to cross the bridge at that time. It's not easy to cross the river, but they do have the support of the British naval vessels, and so that will save them from the colonial attacks. That about wraps up our day. The British pull into Charlestown around midnight. I'll leave you with some closing thoughts. For the British, this day seems like a failure to me. Their goal had been to destroy the weapons at Concord and intimidate the colonial militias. Well, when the British get to Concord, the weapons have been moved, and the British don't really succeed in that goal. And as far as intimidating the colonists, I think in a way the opposite happens. The colonists are emboldened. They learn that they can fight with the British and that they can use their strategies. So it's in a way it's a good day for the colonists. War is always terrible, and the British lose more than 200 soldiers, and the colonists lose more than 100 soldiers. So it is a bloody day. And perhaps one wonders whether this war was inevitable. Historically, all wars often appear inevitable, but why did the British have to go there and get into this battle on Lexington Green that accomplished nothing? If they hadn't done this, if they hadn't pushed the colonists in this way, maybe the colonists would have responded differently. So I guess it's one of those questions that one can never answer. But yeah, did this war have to happen at all? Okay, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this.